All right. We're going to do that by the format of using the polling to just test it. I'll just send it. I didn't do it. Actually, give me one moment. Members, what I'm actually going to do is open all the mics and just by voice respond to the suspension of the rules, and then we'll go on. Once we agree to the suspension, the Premier will then introduce the motion and then give his remarks. Once his remarks are given, the opposition leader will get up and they will get started. Now, all your mics are being open right now, so you may want to show your comment at the moment. And once you have all the mics open, just by a show of voice, is everyone in favor of us suspending the rules?
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Sorry to respond from there.
Yes.
Consider that the House has agreed that we will continue with as the technology just allows me to do individually. I think I've got everybody's mic at this point. Just do a last check. Okay. All right. So we're now the House haven't agreed to the suspension of rules to allow us to conduct business virtually here today, and the suspension to allow the speeches to be limited to 15 minutes. I now put the floor to the Premier to introduce the motion. Premier.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. Can you hear me?
Good morning. Yes.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move the following resolution. Whereas the World Health Organization has declared COVID-19 to be a global pandemic, and whereas COVID-19 continues to be an unprecedented and severe threat to the public health of Bermuda, and whereas in accordance with Section 14.6 of the Constitution and Section 18.2 of the Emergency Powers COVID-19 Shelter-in-Place Regulations 2020, the regulations, the House of Assembly and Senate resolved on the 6th of April 2020 to extend the proclamation of emergency and the duration of the regulations until 6 a.m. on the 18th of April 2020, and communicated that fact by message to the governor. Be it resolved that pursuant to Section 14.6 of the Constitution, that this Honorable House approves the continuance of the state of emergency until 6 a.m. on the 30th of June 2020, and the continuance of the regulations until 6 a.m. on the 2nd of May 2020, pursuant to Section 18.2 of the Emergency Powered COVID-19 Shelter-in-Place Regulations 2020.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. And bear with me. I'm going to just open mics again so we can confirm that there's no objection to the motion being put. No objections, members? No objections, Mr. Premier. Would you like to speak to the motion now? And again,
thank you. Thank you, Mr.
I think we've got most mics muted again, Premier.
Thank you.
Premier, I think, hold on a sec. Somehow we muted you again. One sec.
No problem.
Okay, start over, Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, this House meets in extraordinary session to play its role in the response to this global pandemic. And today's meeting is historic as it is occurring virtually through the internet. The motion before the House today seeks to extend the state of emergency first declared by the governor on April 1st until 6 a.m. on June 30th. However, the shelter-in-place regulations will be extended only until 6 a.m. on the 2nd of May. Mr. Speaker, let me explain. The public health advice is that for shelter-in-place to be most effective, a 28 shutdown is necessary. This represents 2 full 14-day periods of incubation for the virus. On May 2nd, we will have completed that 28-day period. However, Mr. Speaker, under our laws, the power of the governor to make regulations under a state of emergency is the only mechanism that we currently have to continue to appropriately restrict the movement of people and take actions necessary to mitigate the risk of community transmission. It is for this reason that we must extend at least the state of emergency until the end of June. Mr. Speaker, people have already died in Bermuda as a result of this virus. In the coming days, I hope to provide for the public the data that sets out the predictions of what is still to come and how this disease may continue to impact Bermuda. Mr. Speaker, it is no exaggeration to say that the picture painted is sobering and by any measure tragic. The cold reality is that shutting down the island for these 4 weeks will not make this virus go away, and it will not stop people from contracting the virus. This shelter in place is to protect the vulnerable from these consequences and to ensure that our hospital and healthcare system are able to better prepare for the pandemic by acquiring necessary supplies and equipment to ensure that they do not become overwhelmed. Mr. Speaker, when it seems that leaders around the world have employed all possible adjectives to describe the impact of this global pandemic, we are left with a pure and simple reality. And the reality of the situation is that we can only reduce the potential for tragedy in this community by strong intervention. As I face the people of Bermuda in daily press briefings, I have been at great pains to provide as much information as possible. The more we know and understand about this disease, the better we will emerge from its impact on our way of life. Mr. Speaker, the modeling of this pandemic for Bermuda will show a comparison of worst-case scenario versus what is most tellingly described as a better-case scenario. In other words, Mr. Speaker, there is no best-case scenario. The worst-case scenario assumes we do nothing at all. No interventions, no measures of social distancing, a fully opening and functioning society, almost as if the virus was just another feature of the flu season. That scenario suggests that we could see over 700 deaths and a peak of early June. The better case scenario is based on effective interventions along the line of what this government has done over the past few weeks. This means a shelter in place, aggressive and maintained social distancing, and thereafter a measured return to the reopening of business with restrictions to minimize the possible transmission of virus inside of the community. This scenario, the better case scenario, gives a prediction of 263 deaths with a peak in mid-September. Clearly, better is a relative term because even doing what we're doing now will still mean tragedy for too many families. But this, Mr. Speaker, is a global reality. Bermuda is not another world. The real-time learning curve in this pandemic is the importance of testing. Mr. Speaker, in a very short period, I have been forced to apply my mind to the very complex science and regimen that is required to accurately test people for this virus. Every component of the testing process is in global demand, and we have had to bring resources and contacts from the private and public sectors to secure the items required to increase our testing capability in Bermuda. Mr. Speaker, global issues aside, this process has tested my patience and increased my frustration, and I frankly admit that we have not been able to test as much as I would have liked to test at this point. The imposition of self-isolation and mandatory quarantine can only go so far in limiting the risk of community transmission, as it has incredible economic costs. However, I feel able to express some cautious optimism. Mr. Speaker, the public-private contacts to which I referred have borne fruit. We have been able to test thus far due to the dedicated work of Dr. Desiree Spriggs and the Helix Lab, and to further complement our testing capacity, equipment has arrived in Bermuda, and through the incredible efforts of Bermudian geneticist Dr. Karika Weldon, next week we will have additional testing capacity with a custom-created lab at Southside. This lab will be staffed by passionate young Bermudians who have answered the call to help their country at this critical time in our history and to give effect to the government's mandate of aggressive testing. Mr. Speaker, as I indicated in the opening considerations motion, while the state of emergency will be extended to June 30th, the shelter-in-place regulations will end on May 2nd. This too should be explained. Mr. Speaker, in the same manner that we are progressively and gradually tightening restrictions on the movement of people and the operations of business, we must now plan for change. In preparation for May 2nd, the Cabinet will invite the Governor to issue a revised set of regulations, which will likely end the 24-hour shelter-in-place, permit additional businesses to open, and prescribe a regime of home delivery or curbside pickup for customers to avail themselves of services they provide. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, I will discuss with the head of the public service how to resume the provision of those government services suspended or scaled down as a result of the requirement for public officers to work remotely. Mr. Speaker, this is perhaps the most delicate balancing act demanded in the modern era of governance. We must be mindful of the ongoing need to save lives while building a new foundation of this economy so that we can live again. This will not be easy and depends on more than leadership. We must have compassion, patience, and understanding. We have to have continued collaboration and unity between political parties, the public and private sector, and Bermudians and guest workers. And Mr. Speaker, at this time, I want to give homage to the opposition leader. Him and I have been in close contact throughout this, and we have had multiple briefings with his caucus, and I want to also thank them for their support as we continue to go through this unprecedented crisis. People were hurting before COVID-19, and in so many instances, that hurt has been magnified by gigantic shifts in this economy. At every level in this community, lender, borrower, tenant, landlord, employer, and employee, we have all lost something. This government will do its part to renew the hope of people and enhance the potential of the island to recover from this seismic event. Mr. Speaker, as I commend this motion for the support of honorable members, let me sound a clear note of thanks to all those men and women who have met the challenge in this extraordinary time by doing extraordinary things. They wear uniforms of combat trousers and shirts of familiar navy blues. They man cash registers, control lines, stock shelves in stores. They drive buses and haul containers. They keep late nights poring over statistics, providing advice, or doing contact tracing. And Mr. Speaker, behind surgical masks, they risk their own lives to treat the sick among us to the highest possible standards. We owe them our gratitude, and their constant professionalism is one of the silver linings to this global cloud. And we, Mr. Speaker, salute them all. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Premier. I will now recognize the opposition leader. Opposition leader, let me just shut the Premier's mic down. Look your mic. Hold up. Opposition leader, your mic is now open. Sir, can you hear me?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. First, Mr. Speaker, I do want to recognize that this obviously is a very unique situation that we are in, and an opportunity actually as we go forward to move our House of Assembly sessions into a new era. And I'm happy to see that your team have been able to, in very short form, As you know, I was a bit concerned if we would be able to pull this off in such short form, but it has been done. So I want to give thanks to your team. I want to give thanks to the IT team as they have moved forward with this new venture that we are participating in. And I look forward to the following meetings that we will have and the like. I must say that these are unprecedented times. I want to thank the Premier for the opportunity that we have had to have discussions. I am looking forward to intensifying those discussions and having more frequent and longer discussions with the Premier as well. I want to first start out by saying, Mr. Speaker, that we have thanked many people within the community, especially those who fit within the area of emergency services and the fine work that they have been doing. I would like to also highlight at this time, because all of us have come into contact with the regiment during the last couple of weeks as we are moving through this period, and thank them for the thoughtful way that they have pulled us all over who are on the road to ensure that they are doing the inspections as has been meted out by the Minister of National Security. And so I want to say kudos to them. I know it is not easy, and I know at times in frustration that we as a people can get concerned when not quite sure all of what's going on. And they have been the brunt of the success of this, and also they have been the brunt of the regiment of maybe some challenges as we have moved forward during this time. Again, I say thank you to the regiment team. Thank you for the minister for calling them out. They are doing a fantastic job. As we move through this period of time, one of the things that this virus has made very clear is that it is not a respecter of persons. It could care less which part of the island you come from, which ethnicity that you believe that you belong to, what socioeconomic category you believe that you fit in. What is clear about this disease is that it is after our vulnerable. And that is a major concern of all of us. I have heard the concern come from the Premier and his team. I've also heard it come from our team as we move through this process. It is our most vulnerable that are under severe attack from this virus, and we must fight it to the ground and protect our most vulnerable as far as possible. I want to thank Bermuda and for those who have given into the regulations that have been put in place in this state of emergency, who have adhered to the guidelines that have been put out there. But we are still hearing rumors, and we are still hearing of clear evidence that there are those out there who continue to try and move around the regulations to not work within the guidelines that have been set out. And I must say to the Minister of National Security, we support every measure that you need to take in order to ensure that our people are kept safe as we move through this trying time. I want to move to the motion at this point, Mr. Speaker. And a lot of thought has gone into this motion, even though we just received it as of last night. It is important that we all understand clearly where we are and what is going on. As the OBA and the leader, we wholeheartedly support extending our state of emergency period for another 2 weeks till May 2nd. What we are concerned about and what we are not supporting right now is extending the state of emergency through till the end of June 30th. I want to be clear here. We are not saying that this measure will or may not be needed. It most likely may be needed, just not this far in advance when we are still trying to get information pulled together. My concern is we are still collecting data. My concern is we are still analyzing data. My concern is that we are still trying to understand what we are dealing with. We are still attempting to relay as much and accurate information as possible to our people, so the majority, if not all Bermudians, are clear on the direction that we need to go in, and that all of our Bermudians and our guest workers actually get it. Now, let me qualify getting it. What should we be getting, Mr. Speaker? I've outlined two things, and I'm sure if you talk to many folk, they may have other things that they may wish to say to this here. But what we should be getting as a people, as Bermudians and as our guest workers, we must understand that our most precious resource is our people. And any threat to this must be met with swift, informed action. And the second is this: to fight this war against our physical and economic ruin, we must aggressively quarantine, test, and trace. This is important that we all get this. It is important that we do all three: quarantine, test, and trace aggressively, simultaneously. This is the way that we are going to arrest this thing. This is the way that we will continue to see our numbers get better as opposed to getting worse. We must continue with aggressive quarantine, test, and tracing. Now, depending on who you talk to, there are many who feel that we're doing one part aggressively and maybe not some other parts aggressively. What I am saying is that it is clear that we need to get all three done aggressively. I'm not sure if we're at that point yet, and I will qualify that as I go through. Extending these powers is an act of Parliament, and we can meet again to extend if necessary. We now have regulations in place that have not as yet been tabled, and we are about to once again put in place regulations a second time, and the first ones still have not been tabled. That's a concern of mine, and I would have hoped that today we may have, or would have at least at this opportunity, tabled the first regulations that we put through. As we have already seen, things constantly are being changed, fine-tuned, and even sometimes retracted. I believe we must extend our reach to the broader public to ensure we achieve best results, that we achieve as best as possible the right safeguards and also the right liberties for our people. Now, this Balance Act, this is not an easy task, and I recognize what the Premier and his team is going through. And so because this is not an easy task, and so we, understanding that, will work with our government to this end. We support the Premier in extending these emergency measures through to May 2nd, and believe we should not continue on in this matter with regulations and new regulations until we have more information available to us, and we can and until these regulations are tabled, so that we can positively move forward with whatever measures we believe to be the right ones. Now, clearly, we need a better understanding of the PHE model so that we can put in better regulations to fit the required guidelines to achieve our desired results. Unfortunately, this week, in our attempt to understand and get a better layout of the PHE model, we were not able to have that discussion in freeness on Wednesday as we attempted to. We had technical difficulties on Wednesday, and the Premier trying to set this up. I'm not placing any blame on anyone. I just believe at this point, we as an opposition were not given enough time because of these technical difficulties to be very clear on what the model is stating and what we should be analyzing and what it is exactly that we should be doing. We are hearing over and over from the public that they are still confused, still not clear. And so we would like to assist the government in being very clear on the measures that are needed to take place. We very clearly can meet within a week's time or even 2 weeks' time to come back if we need, once we have had the opportunity to go through the modeling, once we have had the opportunity of more data coming in to analyze this and extend the measures if needed be through to June 30th. And so with that in mind, what I'm attempting to say is we believe that the emergency measures must be in place through to May 2nd, and we should meet before that to consider the measures going on into June the 30th. We need to have we need to have more information given to our people so that they clearly understand the measures that are needed. This is a must, and I'm sure and I know that the Premier agrees that we need to continue to put out more information at this present time, based on where we are, still trying to understand the data that is coming in, we must have another 2 weeks period of emergency, a state of emergency, but clearly moving into this position today, there have been many questions, and I know that the government has been bombarded with all kinds of questions about the regulations and the state of emergency. What we need to do now is be very, very clear exactly where we are. We need to be clear on the number of tests that we can actually met out. We need to be clear on the orders that are coming in, the regularity of these orders, and if they're not going to be regular orders coming in, of our ability to test. But the bottom line is we still need more information to move forward. And with that in mind, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank again the Premier for the time that he has dedicated. I know it is not difficult to speaking with myself. We have been bombarding him and some of the ministers with questions on a regular basis or suggestions on a regular basis. I do believe that we can move even swifter if we broaden our scope to the private sector and include them in on some of these decision makings, so that we can get a full comprehensive feel for what is going on out there in our island and the concerns that many people are having. So I'll close with saying we support the measures going forward. We support measures of 2 weeks, a state of emergency through to May 2nd, and we would like to be able to meet a third time under these conditions that you have set up, Mr. Speaker, to flesh out a bit more, and we will wholeheartedly support at that time, once we meet again, whether we need to go into a state of emergency until the end of June the 30th. I want to thank you for this time, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for this opportunity. May God continue to bless us as we move through this period of time, as we work together to achieve saving our most precious resource, our people. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Opposition Leader. The next person is indicated they wish to speak is MHD. Is Mr. Dunkley. I'm going to shut off the mic for the Opposition Leader and then turn on the next mic for speaker. Give me 1 sec. The mic is now on.
Hi, good morning, Mr. Speaker.
Good morning. Mr. Dunkley, you have the floor.
No, Mr. Speaker, I did not ask to speak at this time. I just acknowledged your direction, but I will speak at a later time, so I will defer to my colleague.
Oh, okay. Yours was the first one that responded. Okay. Let me go back to the chat list and see who else would like to speak at this time. 1 sec.
Mr. Speaker?
Mrs. Packard, would you like to speak at this time?
Can you hear me, Mr. Speaker?
Okay, would you like to speak at this time? You're on the list.
I thought that we were going to have a government member and then an opposition member.
Well, I'm just going by the responsive list that if you see on the chat, I'm going by the names that have been responded thus far.
Yes, I mean, I can speak. It would have been useful to hear, somebody from the government, but I certainly can.
Well, your name's next on the list. I'm going by the names as they.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine, Mr. Speaker. And good morning to colleagues, and thank you to everyone for us being able to have this unusual and extraordinary meeting, unprecedented for us. But we are going through an unprecedented experience, that of how COVID-19 is impacting our community. Mr. Speaker, given the Premier's motion, we certainly, as an opposition, agree to the rationale behind ensuring we have an additional 14 days in place, and we have zero objection to that. I think that we can embrace the necessity as we look at how the results are actually coming through and the information that we have that would enable us to make a decision that is important to our people. Mr. Speaker, I believe that as a legislature, we have a responsibility to the electorate to protect not just their civil liberties, but their lives. And at this point in time, I believe we're dealing with a dichotomy in that respect, in as much as people are getting frustrated, they're being not locked down, but they're being asked to shelter in place. They're seeing what would be their normal way of life being stripped away from them, and they want to understand why. So when we have enough information to say to people, listen, this is the experience that we are having. This is what we have seen. Our results have shown us ABC, XYZ. And as a result of that, it is important for us to help you, for us to be able to be in a position to assist people to say, this is why we have to shelter in place. We understand your frustration, but we cannot abdicate our responsibility to scrutinize the decisions of cabinet in a collaborative way. I don't ever want to come across as being critical under these very trying and difficult circumstances. But the unfortunate thing is we did not have the ability to aggressively test at the outset. What we've seen with information that's come through on a worldwide basis, that testing is critical. Testing, tracing, as well as, just making sure that we have the data to quarantine people. So this additional necessity to quarantine, not a problem. But in the absence of good empirical data, Mr. Speaker, I find it a lot easier to be able to go to our people and say, we don't have all the information that we need as yet. So in 2 weeks' time, we will come back again as members of parliament, fulfilling our responsibility to our people to ensure that they understand. I believe that all of us, Mr. Speaker, have in mind the need to minimize frustration. We've seen some people act out. We've heard of situations in which somebody had gone to the grocery store, left the groceries in the car, gone away, and then come back and the groceries were gone. These are the kinds of frustrations that people are experiencing, both because of lack of funding and just because of the mental challenges that they are having, the emotional challenges that they may be having as a result of the extended period of time under which we have to be under these restrictions. So I believe that it's very important for us to understand that if we can come back at a more, at a closer time, as opposed to saying have these powers until June 30th, we've got the existing regs until May 2nd. There's nothing, the Premier didn't really explain why June 30th was the opportunity. I didn't quite get that unless I missed it. But I didn't quite get why June 30th was appropriate and why, given that we've got this technology, that we can't come back in a 2-week period of time. We can call right now a meeting at the drop of a hat. And it would seem to me that if we are able to get more information and we are able to speak to our people on a regular basis, then they would be able to embrace the decisions that Parliament is making and our ability to understand them and to help them to work through their frustration. I do know that, if the Premier can let us know, or the Health Minister, when it's her opportunity, can let us know that, how many complete tests do we have? When we say to people, we're ramping up the ability of laboratories to process tests, that is very positive, and that's something that we all support. But how many kits do we have that are complete? I think I've made mention of the fact, Mr. Speaker, that if we have 1,000 tests, but if we only have, and I'm saying if there are 1,000 tests, and if there are only 50 swabs, then technically we only have 50 tests. These are hypothetical numbers. So I just wanted to ask, how many complete kits do we have, or do we believe that we will be able to have in the short term, such that ramping up the laboratory capacities is going to be an effective and efficient use of the time and the resources that we have. In addition, it would be important to know that we've seen what would appear to be local transmission. The earlier cases that we had, we were able to identify that person A came in on this flight and person B was infected by their association with person A. We've kind of lost that ability more recently, and especially in respect of the results that came through from the Matilda Smith where obviously contact tracing may still be in progress, so we don't have sufficient information in that respect. My question also would be, how many people have been allocated to the contact tracing team? And is there anything that we as members of parliament can do to assist that process? We have people in our communities, and even though we won't have names, we can certainly have case numbers and be able to assist if it's at all possible. Because the more information that we have to feed into the model that we are utilizing would obviously give us more accurate information coming out, and information on which we can go back to our electorate and say to them, listen, I understand the frustrations that you're experiencing, but this is really what we need to do. So, Mr. Speaker, I just wanted to make those points. If we can get some responses here, and I believe it's also important to point out that we are not criticizing. We are trying to have constructive input into the decision-making process. We did have the ability or the opportunity a few days ago to look at the modeling results, and those results, the meeting was abridged through no fault of anybody's, but we don't have a full understanding as an opposition as to exactly what those results were trying to tell us. The Premier has given an overview this morning as to what we've seen in the results, but we have not had the ability to drill down. We were told that we would be able to have a further discussions on that, and unfortunately that has yet to happen, and I'm sure it will happen within the next day or two, so that we have the ability to understand. What we've seen is we had a jump, we had a spike. The one area that we were actually able to test and to know from empirical evidence at the outset, looking at things that were happening in the United States, we knew that the vulnerable societies were our seniors. We put in place, the minister has indicated, rules that indicated where those vulnerabilities are, and that we've put in place rules to manage the nursing homes. However, our major outburst, as we had it, is in a nursing home. So somewhere, notwithstanding the best of intentions and where we're trying to go with this, we want to ensure that whatever new regulations are put in place, that we are able to think them through collectively, and maybe there's something that you, Mr. Speaker, can recognize, or maybe honorable member, one of the backbenchers can recognize as being vital that may not have gone into the mix.
Let me just remind you that you're winding down into your end of your 15 minutes.
Yes, absolutely. And with those comments, Mr. Speaker, recognizing the shortage of time, just looking at how can we work collectively and collaboratively so that our input and our intellect can all meld together to have the best outcome for the people of Bermuda. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honorable Member. The next Honorable Member on the list is Honorable Member Scott. Is that Scott Perrin? Would Mr. Perrin like to participate at this point? Okay, Mr. Perrin, let me just unmute your mic so we can, okay. Your mic is unmuted.
Can you hear me, Mr. Speaker?
I can hear you, yes.
Excellent, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for calling on me. I know that there's a limited amount of time, only 2 hours, and many wish to speak, so I will be as brief as I can and move as quickly. Mr. Speaker, I have 3 points that I wish to raise. Firstly, how did we get here? Secondly, today's motion. And thirdly, what are Bermuda's plans for the future? How did we get here? On the 1st of April, the governor passed a proclamation of emergency, granting the government emergency powers under Bermuda's constitution. Mr. Speaker, this is virtually unprecedented in Bermuda's history. 5 days later, in accordance with our constitution, specifically Article 14 of Bermuda's constitution, the provisions for time of war or emergency, we came back before the House on Monday, the 6th of April. We met and we voted. We voted unanimously to support the proclamation of emergency from the governor and to extend to 6 a.m. on Saturday, the 18th of April, the current shelter at home provisions. That's this Saturday, tomorrow. Mr. Speaker, the opposition has supported and continues to support the government's containment policies to reduce the impact of COVID-19. These policies include increasing public awareness, maintaining social distancing, temporary school and business closures, working from home, and the current shelter-at-home containment strategy. These are all sensible precautions seeking to contain the spread of the virus. Measures intended to reduce the loss of life. Although many will rightly feel their civil liberties are being curtailed, most will understand why this is necessary. Conversely, others may feel the current restrictions do not go far enough. So we accept that the decision-making by the government in these circumstances is not easy, and most Bermudians will understand that. We have given the government time to find its footing on the shifting terrain. And because there is currently no COVID-19 vaccine, the government's stated goal, which the opposition supports, is to lessen the impact of the virus. You will likely have heard the expression, flatten the curve. The virus will still spread, but this spread will be flattened. First contained, then slowed, and hopefully better managed medically. Yes, people will still catch the virus, and yes, deaths may occur. But containment seeks to avoid a spike in COVID-19 cases, which could and likely would overwhelm not only our hospital, but our island. This overwhelming is a tragedy we have witnessed in other places where confinement was not as swift. So we must ensure, as best we can, that our medical professionals do not fall victim. Doctors must not become patients. It is also important, from a constitutional perspective, to caution that none of the regulations passed in recent weeks by the government have been tabled before Parliament. Not the initial regulations setting out the health precautions and restrictions, nor the regulations providing for the broader lockdown. None have been tabled in this House to allow for debate on them.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Should properly be tabled today.
Let us take a point of order. We take the point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, this is the government whip. Point of order on the member. The member is misleading the House. The regulations are hardly ever tabled in the chamber. We always do the legislation, and the regulations then come afterwards. And the regulations have been made public, which is actually something that's moving forward and different for, and actually timely in the situation that we're in.
Mr. Speaker, if I may, as a point of order, just to correct the Attorney General, the regulations of which we're discussing under the Emergency Powers Act are subject to the royal prerogative, and they are not subject to parliamentary scrutiny. And that is something that is important to recognize and to understand. I think that was relayed to the opposition of the first time around. On the second time, on these particular instances, these matters are regulations made by the governor, not regulations made by the government, and they are not subject to parliamentary scrutiny.
Mr. Speaker, that has never previously been conveyed to me or to the Parliament. And if that has been conveyed, we welcome clarification as to when that occurred. But it is wrong to deny this Parliament the right to debate the regulations that apply to each and every citizen in Bermuda. They should be tabled, and we hope the government will do so they can be taken up for debate at the next sitting. Mr. Speaker, secondly, I speak to the motion today. The motion seeks to do two things: to extend the shelter-at-home provisions for 2 weeks. We support that. Secondly, it seeks to do a second thing: to extend the Premier and Cabinet's emergency powers for 10.5 weeks to the 30th of June. We respectfully do not support that. Any extension of emergency powers can be for the same 2-week period as the shelter at home regulations are continued, and this House can properly and should properly come back in 2 weeks and debate any further extension. We are balancing two of the things held most precious by all human beings. We are balancing life and liberty. But the burden on the limitation of liberty, the burden on those seeking to restrain human freedoms, must be justified by those seeking to restrain. Restraint of liberty must be justified. We, the OBA, the opposition, support the extension
Lost him.
of Mr. Speaker, can I be heard? I'm sorry, for some reason it went off for a moment. I'll repeat. We, the OBA, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We, the OBA, the opposition, support the extension of sheltered home provisions by 2 weeks. We do not support the extension of emergency powers for 10 and a half weeks to the 30th of June. We don't know what the terrain will look like in May or June. The House can easily come back in 2 weeks' time or in 4 weeks' time, and we are due back anyway on the 8th of May. So there is no need for draconian emergency powers for 10 and a half weeks. And we call upon the government to amend the motion so the extension of emergency powers is considered again before the 2nd of May. Mr. Speaker, turning to the third matter, which is what are the plans for the future? Coming through the storm of this virus will take some time. People need urgent relief now. Almost 4 weeks ago, on Monday, the 23rd of March, my OBA colleague, the leader of the opposition, Craig Kennedy, MP, called for a bipartisan economic relief commission to be chaired by the Minister of Finance. It would work outside the offered cumbersome process of government. It would have bypassed red tape. We commend the government's existing unemployment relief, but more needs to be done, particularly so in the area of payroll and tax relief. The OBA proposed that consideration be given to payroll tax relief, including specifically the first quarter of 2020. At very least, for small and medium-sized Bermudian businesses. Bermudians are struggling and continue to meet health insurance and other costs of employees who are not at work because doors to businesses are shuttered and no customers or money is coming in. Shelter in place is a very wise precaution, and we support it for the next 2 weeks, but it comes with financial consequences for all Bermudians. And finally, Mr. Speaker, we must also plan for the future, which is void of uncertainty. The truth is, we cannot wait to plan for Bermuda's recovery. Planning for how we restore Bermuda's economy should have started weeks ago, and it cannot wait any longer. My OBA colleague, Pat Gordon-Pamplin, MP, Shadow Minister of Finance, urgently called for a bipartisan commission to create a strategy for the economic recovery of Bermuda once COVID-19 is over. She said this, quote, "While it is right and proper, the government concentrates on ensuring the health and safety of its citizens, we must at the same time plan ahead. Once this is over, we must be able to bounce back." She concluded her comments, "We must be proactive and ready to hit the ground running." Her clarion call to be prepared was almost a month ago. With the greatest respect to the Minister of Finance, we've heard virtually nothing until his speech only 2 days ago. The World Health Organization declared COVID-19 to be a public health emergency of international concern on the 30th of January. Bermuda was afforded the opportunity to prepare not only in terms of being ready to confront the virus, but to plan for the necessary recovery afterwards, to try to fill the void of uncertainty. It is now the 17th of April. A plan for recovery was desperately needed then and remains desperately needed now. Let's get going together. Bermuda was not in great shape before COVID-19. Things are going to get worse before they get better. And we need to come together as an island and a nation to do our utmost to make sure we have anticipated problems before they happen. We must chart our course now, and we must prepare now. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Anthony Chairman. I believe Minister Keynes, if I'm correct, would like to contribute at this time.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Keynes, feel free to join in.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I be heard, Mr. Speaker?
Yes, we can hear you.
Mr. Speaker, over the last 2 weeks or before, we have seen the Premier, the Honorable David Byrd, put together a pandemic plan that has prepared this country to deal with some of the worst circumstances in over 100 years. We have seen, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Health mobilize a health ministry and health professionals and deal with a pandemic, exercising human leadership. We have the opportunity to see our country at a most difficult set of circumstances, managing all of these circumstances with aplomb. The Premier at every occasion has taken the opportunity to leverage relationships with the opposition, with the business community, and with the general public. We have heard from members of the public that have shared that they are pleased with the amount of information that is being given to the members of the Bermuda public, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. We have seen daily press conferences outlining the plans that the Bermuda government has for the country. Mr. Speaker, with reference to the national security of this country, we have seen the Bermuda Regiment, Bermuda Police Service, the Department of Immigration, Customs, Bermuda Department of Corrections, and the Fire Service. They have enveloped this country with leadership, with discipline, and with honor to make sure the people of Bermuda are safe. Mr. Speaker, it has been the sole purpose of our leader, the Honorable David Birch MP, JP MP, to make sure that our country is safe and that our country is protected during these difficult times. I must highlight, Mr. Speaker, that on every occasion we have been conversing with the opposition on many different fronts. Several members of the opposition reach out to me on a daily basis, giving me advice, giving me guidance, and helping us to get through some circumstances. I take advice from members in our backbench and in our caucus, and together we have put on the backbench our ego, self-aggrandizement, and partisanship to make sure that our country is balanced, is protected, and that we can fight through this pandemic. Today should be no different. Mr. Speaker, the extension of the emergency order is simply to make sure that the government is flexible, the government is nimble to deal with any emergency that arises. It is a person that does not understand the benefits of a nimble government that will suggest that the government is trying to take away the civil liberties of the members of the public. We understand the importance, the sanctity of freedom of movement, the sanctity of having the ability to go to and from. But we also understand, Mr. Speaker, that we are living in perilous times. This should not be the opportunity for any member of parliament on either side to get on a soapbox and to fight against the government simply because that is the partisan nature. That is how we've been raised in tribalism. You cannot privately, online, and in our private conversation, say that you support the movements of the government and the direction of the government, and publicly now proclaim that we are doing things that are not in good and best keeping of democracy. We have an opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to walk this country through a difficult set of circumstances. We have heard this week where the Minister of Finance has indicated that he will set up a committee with key business stakeholders and fast forward the plan. We need to allow us to put together the plan. We support the opportunity for us to continue to work together as a team, as a country, bringing together all sides to work through this difficult set of circumstances. Mr. Speaker, I believe that together we can get through it. We will leave no stone unturned. We realize now that Bermuda Incorporated, all of us must work together. Mr. Speaker, there is no desire, there is no plan There's no sinister plot to evade, to take away, to eliminate the rights of the citizens of Bermuda. The premier of this country has a delicate balance to protect the civil liberties, but also to make sure that we can do everything possible to prevent the spread of this pandemic. I would like to thank all of the members of parliament who have been reaching out to the Ministry of National Security. We value your input. We value the bipartisan approach. I'd like to thank the members of our backbench and our caucus who daily reach out to me and give me guidance. To the members of the public who email, send on Instagram, on Facebook, ideas, suggestions. We will continue to work together as a team. This is not about any individual. This is about making sure that our country rises, that we thrive, and that we put a plan together for the future. It will not be easy, Mr. Speaker, but I believe together we will do it. The extension of the emergency powers, it is not a flight of fancy. It is simply what we want to do is to make the government more nimble, for us to be able to consider everything and to move without having to mobilize the entire parliament to make our next move. Mr. Speaker, and with that, I say thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mrs. Gaines, you're complete?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you for your contribution, Mr. Gaines. I now recognize I think it's Ben Smith, Member Smith. Would you like to make your contribution at this time?
Yes, good morning, Mr. Speaker.
Good morning.
I'd personally like to thank Minister Keynes for the communication I've had with him going back and forth during this time period. And I'd like to echo his sentiment to thank all the members within our national security, the regiment, the police, customs, fire, and prisons. Because when we are in the situation that we are in presently, it is important that we realize that this group that has put themselves forward to protect this country are in a situation where they have to put themselves at risk in order to protect us. So it's important that we thank them for their continued service to the country in making sure that we all feel a little more safe and secure. But Mr. Speaker, it's also important that we understand that during this unprecedented time, the country is feeling anxious. We were in the midst of a 2-week shelter in place. Many people are in a situation where, for the first time in a long time, they're without work. They're used to schedules. They're used to being up early and being able to put forth their ability to work, their ability to be part of this society, and now they're at home and they're feeling the anxiety. So what happens is we do have communication daily, information that is being presented by the government, and it is not our position to just criticize or say that the government isn't doing a good job, because that's not correct. We have seen the leadership making sure that the population is informed on an ongoing basis, but there is sometimes that maybe a little more detail would be helpful. Because as we are in a situation where we have sheltered in place for 2 weeks, and now we're extending for a further 2 weeks, part of the process is going to be, are we testing at the level that is needed for us to take care of the country? Because if we do not have the swabs that allow us to test aggressively, how will we come out of the 2-week shelter in place and then be able to get back to some normalcy? So that's why it is an important point for us to know what that capacity looks like. We hear, understanding the premier has said to the country that they are trying to ramp up the testing, but we also all understand that there's a shortage worldwide. So as we continue to push forward this shelter in place, the level of anxiety will continue to go up because people are without the level of money that they would have had. People are now dipping into their savings. Businesses that were feeling the weight of our economy prior to COVID-19, specifically our retail sector, they were already in the brink of going underwater, and now they have been shut down. This is a part of our economy that really has a large amount of Bermudians working. Well, most of those positions are closed. So when we are making decisions to continue to move forward with shelter in place, it's important that we give some clarity of how we are going to be able to not only test at an aggressive level, but also be able to show how we can test for temperatures so that we have the scanners and thermometers that are allowing us to make sure that as we open, we know whether people are going to be healthy or not healthy. Because obviously, these are the pieces that are going to allow our community to feel comfortable as we start to reemerge. If we are not prepared to do that, then we will continue to have to be in a situation where we're going to have to shelter in place for longer periods of time. I believe that getting more information about those particular supplies, so the amount of swabs, which allows us to know how much testing we have, the ability to scan our frontline workers, the people that are working in our grocery stores and our pharmacies, to make sure that the people in our nursing homes and the workers in our nursing homes, if we have to test ourselves by checking our temperature on an ongoing basis, we need to make sure that those supplies are available widely so that everybody's in that position. Because I think that what happens now is people are sheltered at home and they're seeing that the numbers are going up even though we have been in this position. And that's where the anxiety starts to happen. When they hear numbers like we are going to continue to be moving forward until June 30th, that anxiety level will continue to grow. And I understand that this is a balancing act. It's difficult because nobody really has an answer of how we are going to be able to come out of this. But as we are here, what is happening is the balancing part is that the economy is going to continue to falter while we are trying to balance saving lives in Bermuda. But on the other side of this, if we don't have a way for us to come out of this with aggressive testing and with the ability to scan our population, and we have to stay closed longer because of the limited supplies, we will end up in a situation where we stay in this position longer than we really need to or really should, and it's going to be difficult for us to come back. So if we could have more information on how the retail sector is going to be supported, I think it's important for everybody to know how we are going to be able to come out of on the other side of this, not just from a health issue, protecting our population, preventing deaths, but also so that people will continue to be able to work hard and contribute to our society. I'd like to thank all of our frontline workers. I'd like to thank everybody that has been reaching out and being supportive. I understand that the government ministers and the premier, this is a very difficult task that you are going through, and we give you the full support, but we also need to make sure that we have the ability to continue to communicate, which is the reason why we would like to have the opportunity to give our voice to this conversation. And that is going to happen by us having this opportunity to come back with this virtual House of Assembly. It means that we can have debate at any time. So we support May 2nd, and we would also support coming back so that we can continue in this fashion and be able to get information, not just coming out from the government on a daily basis, but also the ability for questions to be asked, which allows a broader part of the community to understand the details of what is happening and why these decisions are being made. And with that, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Speaker, for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. I appreciate your comments. Anyone else wish to speak? I have Mr. Dunkley Don, MP Dunkley Don as the next member. Dunkley, would you like to speak now?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, go right ahead. MP Dunkley has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I start my comments this morning, let me start out by giving thanks to all of those, starting from the Premier and colleagues who have worked so hard to try to put us in a better position, especially all the frontline workers, all the essential workers, everyone who has been hard at work to make sure that we can stay as safe and healthy as possible. And also, Mr. Speaker, with a very heavy heart, and I'm sure speaking for all members of the House, let me extend my prayers and blessings to everyone who's been infected and been fighting the virus. And certainly, Mr. Speaker, condolences publicly to the family and the friends of 5 who have tragically lost their life in fighting the battle of this deadly virus. It goes to show, as colleagues have said, that this virus knows no boundaries. As we head through this very rough and rocky journey, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to see that collaboration and communication has been at the forefront. And I want to thank the Premier and his colleagues for ensuring that that's the case. It hasn't always worked out as we'd expect, because some of the meetings have been able to be conducted in an appropriate place, but still, we've tried. And I think generally, in a dark time for our community, people are very happy to see politicians from both sides of the aisle coming together to face this crisis head on and to move this community forward. So we generally support that. And I'd like to especially thank Minister Keynes for all his energy and taking comments and advice and some criticism from time to time from our colleagues as we move forward. Mr. Speaker, it is important that in this crisis that we have unity as a community. But as my colleague, the Honorable Scott Pierman, said in a column the other day, that solidarity doesn't mean that we should not give advice and offer constructive criticism as we move forward, because the decisions that are made are made in the best vein when people have the ability to input into them. Unity in crisis means that we have to speak frankly to people from time to time as we can move forward. Let's face it, Mr. Speaker and colleagues, this island has been paralyzed by COVID-19. COVID-19 does not discriminate between black and white, between East and West, between Bermudians and non-Bermudians, between rich and poor. It can affect any one of us at any time if we don't take the precautions. So I commend the government for the shelter in place. But Mr. Speaker, as my colleagues have said, we have challenges here today because while we support the shelter in place, we're still trying to come to grasp with the reasons that the government has asked for the state of emergency to be extended until the end of June. And at this point, the government has not said the need why it needs to be extended to the 30th of June, clearly, because we can come back to the House through these virtual meetings. We can discuss important topics in relation to this. The People's House can operate virtually, as we've proven here today, and the people still need to have a voice. And why is that critical, Mr. Speaker? Because we are going through something which we all agree we have never seen before in our lifetime. And certainly this country hasn't seen it for over 100 years, where we're so paralyzed, where people live in fear. And while the government is trying to put information out to allow us to be in a better position to understand this, there's still so many unanswered questions and so much fear and so much concern that people have every day. The model that the government is using has only just started to see some scope within the community. My colleagues have mentioned the opposition had a chance to get onto a meeting Wednesday to discuss it, but unfortunately some of us did not have the ability to get online and get it sorted contracted out to review the model. And having said that, because the model hasn't been understood enough, hasn't been questioned enough, people still live with great concern. We need to accept, Mr. Speaker, as I think we all have, that information is the key. And as we go through something that is so critical in our life that very few people understand, certainly not most of the public that we serve day to day, they don't understand what is next for Bermuda, where we are. Where do we stand on that curve of infections? When is going to be our worst period of time for infections, for hospital care? All of those critical questions need to be answered. And with this information, Mr. Speaker, I contend that it will help people accept and appreciate the conditions that are imposed on us by staying in place. It will help people learn more about the ever-changing environment that we live in today. It will help people understand what we need to see to progress. Because, Mr. Speaker, I ask a question to the Honorable Premier and colleagues. In 2 weeks' time, as we come to the end of the extension to May 2nd, what does the government need to see to be able to ease restrictions on the shelter in place? What is the progress line that we need to see? And with all this information, it provides people hope as they go through the day-to-day when they're sheltered, when they're shut in. It brings them along through tough times, Mr. Speaker, and I think that's important. With information, we can bring people along through these tough times. It gives them some hope when constantly, from day to day, they're challenged with feeling positive about the next step. When they have their down days, when their strength is tested, when their stamina is tested, when our mental well-being is put under the test, it allows people to say, yes, we are facing a very rocky journey, but it will get better as we move forward. So having said that, Mr. Speaker, I would hope that the government would provide more information on the model. It's taken some time to roll out to the public. It needs to happen forthwith for people to have understanding and move forward on that. But we need to also understand, as my colleague said, that this is going to be a multi-step process. The first step is getting through the shelter in place. The second step is the rebuilding the economy. Because having said that, Mr. Speaker, COVID-19 is going to affect all of us, no matter who we are. And our economy wasn't in great shape before then. And we need to realize that while people struggled before, and they're going to struggle even more after we come through this because of the impact of COVID-19. And I applaud government to date for some of the programs that they put in place with the unemployment benefit. But the road to getting back on our feet is going to be a difficult one because the immense challenges reach so far into our community, and there are no simple answers or simple programs that we can act to help people get through the challenge that we face. And Mr. Speaker, as we look at this state of emergency that is due to continue until the 30th of June, and the opposition doesn't agree with it, one of the reasons why it's more important than ever that this House continues to meet is because the regulations under the royal prerogative are discussed by the Premier and colleagues nationally when they come to their broadcast, but they're only laid and the House never gets a chance to debate them. It is critically important that the People's House has an opportunity to debate important information as we go through this journey of the state of emergency. I fully expect, Mr. Speaker, over the next 2 weeks, it to be very difficult at times. I would hope we would see some progress, but I understand and accept because of what this virus has done on countries throughout the world. I understand, Mr. Speaker, that we probably still have some upward trajectory to face on this curve of infections. And I fully expect that easing of restrictions is going to be also a long journey for us as we go through. And that makes it even more critical that the 36 members elected can have an opportunity to speak for the people that they represent. And the government has an opportunity to listen what all members have to say. And I know the government is trying very hard. I can't speak for my honorable colleagues, Mr. Speaker, but I can say that I'm sure we have all been inundated in the past couple of weeks, and certainly the past couple of days when they realized we are having this virtual session. people have been inundating and saying, please ask these questions. Please make these points for us. We need to keep open the channels of communication, and we need to keep open the ability for you, Mr. Speaker, in the House of Assembly to call a meeting where we can discuss this matter. We could make suggestions to the Premier and his colleagues. Now, my colleagues have asked some very important questions, and I hope we get those answered going forward. One is, we would like to see more clarity on, over the next couple of days and weeks, what our aggressive testing regime is going to mean. How many tests a day will be conducted? What is the focus on these tests? Will they be focusing in on our frontline workers, our healthcare workers? Will they be focusing in on hotspots in the community? Things like that are important for people to understand where we are and where we're going next. In addition, Mr. Speaker, there's been a lot of talk about contact tracing, and we applaud contact tracing 100%, but it would be very helpful for the people that we serve to get some understanding of the success of contact tracing, what information it has brought to bear that impacts our model, and how we are in a better position because of it. So people need to know an understanding of what contact tracing means and how successful we are on tracking it down, because obviously if contact tracing is successful, we could limit the spread of the virus in any way, because we can find out the roots of where it has been spread. Mr. Speaker, I believe it would also be a benefit for the community if the government was able to tell us what the infection rate is. Because if the infection rate is 1 to 1.5, we have serious issues. And easing of restrictions cannot be considered in any sustainable way unless that infection rate gets down somewhere below 0.9. And even at that time, easing of restrictions will have to be done very carefully, because that infection rate can go back up again. And that's what we always worry about. Once you ease restrictions, the virus can come back. And so this is a slow process as we go through it. I applaud the government on providing information, but there was much more information that needs to be provided. I will conclude, Mr. Speaker, by saying that I support the opposition leader and colleagues when we talked about having a bipartisan committee to look at the way forward. We need to start talking about when the airport is going to be opened up, how we're going to support tourism, because tourism at this point in time, like many other jurisdictions, is dead on the vine. And many properties will not be even to open their doors in the coming months, and perhaps until next year, unless we do something to help them move forward. As my colleague Ben Smith talked about, retail business is struggling. They will need a lifeline. And as we all know, there are many people that are getting unemployment insurance, but when that 12 weeks ends up, the sun will rise, but they will still be in a very difficult position. And so here we are in the opposition. We are ready to work with the government. We're ready to provide advice to the government. We're ready to support the government. But we cannot today, Mr. Speaker, support the state of emergency being extended to the end of June, when we have the ability to come back any day we want to Parliament to debate things, to discuss things, and approve an extension going forward. We support shelter in place to the end of May, to May 2nd. We look forward to what will be announced on easing restrictions, and we will continue to support the government, but we will make sure that we stand up and say what concerns we have. So in closing, Mr. Speaker, I look forward to the Honorable Premier when he has an opportunity to wrap up, and I hope that he is getting the rest and the nutrition that he needs to continue to work those long, tough days like we all are doing. This is a long journey, so we can't think that we are super people and we will get through it without taking care of ourselves. We need to take care of ourselves as well. But we would look for the Premier and his colleagues to say why it needs to be extended until June 30th, why we can't extend it until May 2nd, come back and meet again, and let the people's voice be heard through all 36 members of Parliament. Mr. Speaker, thank you, and to you and colleagues, I wish you health and safety, and together we will get through this and we will rise again, because Bermudians and our residents are strong. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, MP. The next member that indicated we should speak at this time is Minister De Silva.
Mr. Speaker, I have a point of order. Mr. Speaker.
Under order?
And I'm just going to raise it at the end of the honorable member who just spoke for a purpose of clarification, because it's been raised a number of times, and I put it in the chat, Mr. Speaker. There keeps being this discussion about the issue of the debate of regulations inside the House. And it has to be continually reminded, as I've said before, that these particular regulations are made under the power of the Crown and are not subject to parliamentary scrutiny. As I indicated to members of the opposition when we met with them on Wednesday, and I had indicated the fact that we were going to look to extend the emergency powers until the end of June, which is the longest possible allowable time. We said at that point in time that it is to give us the time and opportunity to come up with public health acts that allow us to impose the type of restrictions which are necessary in order to ensure that the country can manage this type of thing. Other countries have the ability to do these restrictions without emergency powers. Unfortunately, in Bermuda, we do not have those particular abilities under our old Public Health Act. So the view is to put in place new legislation, and when new legislation is put in place, that the emergency powers can be rescinded. The fact is, however, Mr. Speaker, that the point to take it all the way to the 30th is the maximum allowable time, because as is stated, we are looking at a peak under the better case scenario of September, and we will need to be flexible on and off again. And what is important is that the government is focused on managing this crisis. So I'm sorry for that long intervention, Mr. Speaker. I hope that other members will be guided by that. I'm happy to answer members' questions when we come towards the conclusion.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. We look forward to having your right to reply at the end of the motion. I believe, Minister Silva, would you still like to speak?
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order?
A point of clarification, that's what the Honorable Premier just said.
Is that, Mr. Dunkley? Dunkley?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Yes,
yes,
okay.
Mr. Speaker. Yes, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the clarification that the Honorable Premier has just provided. However, having said even what the Honorable Premier said, that doesn't mean that we cannot come back as a legislature and discuss regulations that have been or are being enacted. The government obviously has the ability and the authority to enact legislation, and the governor will have some hand in that as well. Our point is that as members of the legislature, we should have the ability to speak for the people, to discuss these regulations, and because we can meet virtually, we can meet anytime you call a meeting, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for that point of clarification and order.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I have to clarify. It is very important, Mr. Speaker. I agree with the honorable member that it makes sense for the House of Assembly to be able to debate these items, and that is the precise reason why we are going to bring into place legislation that will subject this to parliamentary scrutiny. Nobody wants to be in a position where we are currently right now. However, the fact is, what we are dealing with is a public health crisis that our modeling says is going to take us at least all the way to September, even in a better case scenario. So we have to make sure that we are focused on this. So I accept that all the members want to have this type of scrutiny. It makes perfect sense in order to do that. But right now, the government must have the flexibility that it needs in order to continue to manage this particular public health crisis. And that is what we laid out. I find it actually surprising as we went over this in a meeting on Wednesday, and I explained the rationale and the amendments that will be coming to the Public Health Act to ensure that the requisite parliamentary scrutiny can be given as we move forward. It is not the perfect situation where we are now, Mr. Speaker. It is not. We don't like this situation, but we have to do it because this is the only laws that we have right now that enable us to put in the protections to make sure that we do not reach that dreaded 700 number that our modeling is showing us.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. We'll move on to the next member who indicated, I believe it's Minister De Silva. Minister De Silva, I'm going to unmute your mic now.
Okay. Mr. Speaker, just a short point of order.
We're mindful of the time that's left here. We're trying to get the other speakers who have indicated they'd like to speak the opportunity before we have to wrap up.
I'll keep it to 20 seconds, Mr. Speaker, if you will invite me.
I'll invite you 20 seconds and that's it.
Thand you, Mr. Speaker.
Seconds and now.
Appreciate the Premier's explanation. When will the legislation be coming, as all members weren't in that Wednesday meeting for technical difficulties? If the opposition has an understanding of when, then we can consider that.
Consider, Mr. Speaker, the legislation is one of the urgent priorities of this government, as the current situation is not ideal and we do not like it. At the point in time when that legislation is brought to the House of Assembly and passed by the Senate, the cabinet will ask the governor to revoke the emergency powers declaration. But it is extended for its full period in time. Just we don't know what may happen. There could be an outbreak. There could be members of the House of Assembly that come down with it. There are lots of different things that may or may not happen. But the thing that I told honorable members is that we are going to bring the legislation as quickly as possible so that we can have the power underneath the regular process in order to implement these things, as everyone must recognize that an emergency powers resolution, an emergency powers act, is not the best way in which to handle it. However, unfortunately, it is the only way that we can actually put inside the requisite controls to preserve lives in the country.
Thank you. Mr. De Silva, would you like to add your contribution, Minister?
Can you hear me, Mr. Speaker?
Loud and clear.
Okay. No, I would defer and let's wait for the leader's comment. Whilst I have the floor, I'd just like to thank all the people on not only on the front line, Mr. Speaker, but we've had many people that are what I call unsung heroes that are working behind the scenes and delivering food and supplies to our people that are immobile. So I'd just like to take that opportunity to thank them. And of course, I think when the Premier replies, I think he'll cover all bases. Thank you very much.
Okay. The next member is the Honorable Member Atherton, as indicated. Would you like to speak now? Member, would you like to speak now?
Yes, please, Mr. Premier.
Your mic is on mute. Speaker, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, yes, please.
Got it right.
Sorry.
Okay. You have the
Okay.
floor.
First of all, I want to say, Mr. Speaker, that I think it's important for us to understand that the concerns that the opposition is raising right now is not a partisan issue. We too have had people out there, members of the public, asking us about why the regulations are in place, why they aren't able to do certain things, and therefore it's important for us to get clear that we are representing the people of Bermuda when we express their concerns. I think with respect to understanding the benefits of a nimble government, yes, we know that the government has to make decisions, and we know that they're trying to get as much input, which is why the opposition has felt freely that it should give suggestions, come forward, ask questions, so that the people of Bermuda can believe that we're trying to make sure that Bermuda survives this. But I think what we have to understand is that for the people of Bermuda, we hear things about testing, we hear things about orders, we hear things about tracing, but the bottom line for them is that they want to understand why we're doing what we're doing, what can be expected, because they want to ensure that it works. They want to understand what the results are supposed to be, and they want to understand, will they be sufficient to keep this virus from spreading further, or will we have to do something more? And unless we have the ability to be able to have a target, know how well we're meeting it, and know what changes that we have to make, the people of Bermuda are wondering, are we doing enough? Should they be doing more? And you know what Bermuda's like, Mr. Speaker? Everybody hears something, and in the absence of definitive statements, they make up their own conclusions. And I want to say something, because I think we forget that it's our job, and I say it's our job as the opposition, it's our job as people of Bermuda to understand the process and to question what is being targeted, because we need to ensure that it's going to meet the desired result. We also need to understand that if problems are coming up, that we know that the government has put in some modifications to achieve the results that we need, and to make sure that these things are done in a timely manner. And Mr. Speaker, I thought to myself, we don't realize, but this is the equivalent of Bermuda's performance measure. be it at budget time, we have performance measures there, and we tell the people of Bermuda, this is what we're going to do, and then after a year later, you go back and you say how well you achieved it. In some cases we achieve it, and in some cases we don't. But this performance measure for Bermuda has some very significant and important targets, in the sense that if we don't do this right, more people are going to get this virus. If we don't do this right, more people are not only going to be infected, unfortunately, the numbers of deaths are going to increase. So that when we ask the questions, we want to make sure that the targets that we have set are achievable. We want to make sure that the basis on which these targets have been set are also they're also logical in the Bermuda context, because whether we like it or not, Bermuda has some unique characteristics in terms of what we have to do in terms of getting test kits here, what we have to do in terms of being able to do the tests, what are we going to have to do with respect to tracing, etc. I said to someone at some point in time that I thought that Bermuda had a unique opportunity because of our size. One, once we closed our borders down, we were then able to stop overseas transmission. We then could turn around and focus on local transmission. I also said that because of our size, we should have been able to trace through.
I was coming in because I have to print something I can't print at home, so I have to come in.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker.
Somebody's mic is on. Somebody's mic is on. You turn your mic off.
We have the ability when it comes to tracing to know that we don't have an unlimited population. Our population here is fairly manageable, in my opinion. But you have to make sure that the resources are there. We also have to make sure that the people understand very clearly the questions that they're being asked, and be as honest as they can in terms of who they have been in touch with, or where they have been, because that's the only way that tracing is going to work. I also had a real concern, Mr. Speaker, because knowing from the get-go that the people that are going to be most affected are those people who are vulnerable, those people that have medical problems, but also those people, but just by virtue of the fact that they are the elderly, that they are those individuals who are going to be most affected by coming in contact with other people who, based on their age, is probably able to manage it, because this is how we get the issue of people being asymptomatic and just going along and not understanding, and other people coming in contact with them and being wiped out. So, Mr. Speaker, when I hear and when we ask questions about how, at what point in time were the rest homes and nursing homes told to stop having people come in there, when we ask questions about where did we stand with respect to having anybody that was a staff member at the nursing homes and rest homes being tested, when we ask questions about how we were doing with respect to tracing, and you don't get what I call
point of order, Mr. Speaker.
We'll take the point of order.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker. The member is misleading the House. The Minister of Health answered every question with reference to when people were asked to stop visiting the nursing home. She's being very clear publicly and talking directly to the opposition with reference to testing and testing procedures, who will be tested and when they will be tested and why they would not be tested. It is incorrect to say that we have not been clear about those procedures. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member.
Mr. Speaker, with no respect, I shouldn't say with all due respect, I am going to say that we have been asking the questions about the testing long before the minister started to tell us questions, because the initial questions were about nursing homes in general. It wasn't about a specific nursing rest home. And I think what people need to understand is that when you ask these things, the answers that you get are not as precise as they could be. And that is where we have the problem. Mr. Speaker, as we go forward, one of the concerns, and this is the conclusion that I have drawn, is the fact that we have not been able to aggressively test as the Premier wanted us to do or said we were going to do, is because we didn't have the number of tests. And because we didn't have the number of tests, we had to manage with what we had, and we had to decide who the test should be given to in terms of people most likely to be affected and spread. I understand that, but let's be honest with all of this. If you have an issue in terms of testing, a number of tests, therefore you have to say that there is some degree of prioritization and let the people of Bermuda understand. Even if we have to say we didn't intend to have a restriction on the number of tests we had, we were out there doing what we wanted, but our efforts didn't result in the timeliness of what we had hoped. That at least lets the people know why the numbers of tests are. And I mean, most people who understand the science could say, okay, if these are the number of tests you have, it's 10 or whatever else, the numbers that we had in the beginning, you knew that they were not going to be that strong because you had 80 tests and you're going to spread them all out. You can't do 80 in the first. You have to try and give them to the people who are most logically been exposed to see whether you have to do something about managing them, because we understand that it's managing and we understand that it's important for us to try and test those people. I think, Mr. Speaker, what we also understand, which is something that we're all learning, Bermuda learned the same way the rest of the country learned, is the fact that, you know, the people that are asymptomatic, that, you know, we realize now that they're out there, they don't realize what's happening, but they're exposing other people. And therefore, this whole thing about tracing is so important. This whole thing about people understanding how you protect yourself in terms of washing your hands and going out there and having masks on and not going out and visiting your vulnerable people, whether they're elderly or not. All of these things, I know the government has been trying to get the people of Bermuda to understand. But unfortunately, like everything else, not everybody understands, and therefore we have to keep saying it over and over. But getting back to where we are today, Mr. Speaker, I think it's important to realize that in order for the people of Bermuda to say, let me be comfortable with the fact that I am going to not be able to have the ability to assemble and do what I want, and I'm going to turn around and say that there's a regulation that says I can't do all of these things until the end of June, that they need to understand the logic of doing this and what the government hopes to achieve. And when I say what the government hopes to achieve, they have to see how I know that it's too early to talk about how the curve is bending, but you have Public Health England telling us certain things. They obviously have some projections, and we have to know, are we meeting those projections? And they also have to know that in terms of the testing, in terms of the isolation and those other things, are we doing that in a manner that says that the parameters, the presumptions, but when you do this, when you come up with modeling, have some presumptions, and you have to make sure that those presumptions are actually real. The presumptions are in terms of the tracing, the presumptions in terms of the numbers of tests that you could do. I'm really pleased that we're actually going to have another lab open up. I'm disappointed when I hear some of the things that we don't have, which means that having the kits means that you don't actually have as much of what you think you had, because there's some things there that are what I call limiters. And those limiters mean that you can't do the whole process until everything's there. So, Mr. Speaker, I, like my colleagues, I'm supportive of what the government has to do with respect to having us staying inside, having us being in place, going out, not making sure that we do anything to impact others.
Remember, you have less than a minute on your time.
Okay, but I do think, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate what the Premier said with respect to the legislation, and I think that that's why it's important, because if legislation is coming, till that comes, the people of Bermuda have to know, in the interim, how are you doing in terms of what you wanted to achieve when you're telling us stay at home? Are we achieving that goal, that target? If we are, they'll feel more comfortable. If they're not, they'll want to know, what else are we doing differently? What are we changing to make sure this happens? Mr. Speaker, without that, there's a degree of uncomfortableness in terms of extending this. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honorable Member. Next Honorable Member is the Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, you have the floor. Let me see if we can get your mic open for you, Deputy. One sec. Yeah, I'm trying. Deep purchase. Yes, you're on now, Deputy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank all those that are on the front line, all the healthcare workers, the caregivers, our sanitation workers, the Bermuda Regiment, the police, the chief medical officer, and also, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to give thanks to the local business community, the international business community, for all the assistance they have given us and the people of Bermuda. Mr. Speaker, let me just say that the order to the end of June, to me, is not an issue, because if it was an issue, the governor who resides on Langton Hill would have informed the premier it's too long. And it's only there as a provision if we need it. So it's not an issue to be debating and say we don't agree or disagree. It's, to me, is nonsense, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when the opposition are calling for more information, the information is given daily. The premier and his team are there, and they're there as long as it takes necessary questions coming from the press and everybody else, and given that information. Mr. Speaker, all the policies and regulations for this pandemic that we're dealing with has come from the medical health professionals. Let me be clear, because it seems like some of the opposition feel that we sit down and just make decisions amongst ourselves.
Come on.
We are guided
Your mic
by
is on now.
health professionals. No one else. Let's be clear about that. And Mr. Speaker, let me say this here, that we have been getting approval from just about everyone that I've talked to about the leadership of this situation we have. We've been applauded from all walks of life. And to come and say that some of the comments I've heard this morning would have somebody think a little different. The Premier has made it quite clear. He's been in touch, been talking with the leader of the opposition, and I know as I think the opposition leader said himself this morning, he has talked to the caucus of the OBA, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let me say this here, that any plan you put in place, whether it be in Bermuda, United States, or the UK, you're not going to please everybody. That's just the way it is. But it doesn't stop us from trying to please everybody, Mr. Speaker. Let me say, Mr. Speaker, I forgot to say earlier that we pray for those that have been afflicted with this virus. We hope they have a very speedy recovery, and let's get Bermuda back to where we should be. Mr. Speaker, people have got to realize that we must abide by the rules that are in place. The Premier has enunciated daily. People are dying. We do not want that. And I suppose some people say, well, if people want to die, then they do what they want to do. But that's not where we are as a government. We want to save everybody, regardless of whether you hear or you can't hear. So, Mr. Speaker, discipline is the key. And, you know, if you think about years ago, the older folks during the World War I and II, what they had to go through. We have so much more than they had. But they subscribe to discipline. They didn't have no television at home and computers and all that type of stuff. But they did what they was directed to do, and they came through it, Mr. Speaker. So I would just ask everybody, let me say this first, that it appears to some, if the government say, let's start this at 1 o'clock, some would say we should have started at 12:30. We shouldn't be there. If the government says start at 1, let's start at 1. And again, Mr. Speaker, we ask everybody to practice discipline. Because if we practice discipline, we can get out of this situation quicker than we envision. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Deputy. Members, with the mindful that we're trying to have this debate wrap up around noonday, and it's 10 to 12 now. I would like to have the Premier do his closing, his reply to the motion, and then we can put the motion. Mr. Premier?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, there have been a number of comments from honorable members. And so I will do my best to answer them while keeping in time, recognizing it's 11:50, and the motion that you passed at the beginning limited this sitting to 2 hours. So I want to ensure that I answer as many questions as possible. Mr. Speaker, I want to again pay tribute to you for organizing this. I think it's actually worked pretty well. I'm rather surprised that it has worked as well as it has, and I hope that people have been able to listen and I guess and see Parliament at work.
All on the learning curves under these conditions.
Thank you, sir. I think that it is, I just want to start my statements by saying that as someone who sat in the House Assembly for the first time in opposition and was there for 4.5 years, I recognize the important value that the opposition plays in a democracy. And holding the government to account and asking questions is what makes our democracy vibrant and strong. And there is no way, shape, or form that I will ever want to curtail that effort whatsoever. And so I welcome the scrutiny and I welcome the questions of members of the opposition, because there may be questions that people certainly want answers to. And I do also want to make sure that I am quick with my reply today, as there is the second meeting this week with the members of the opposition and officials from the Ministry of Health to go over further modeling information and to answer further questions of which they may have, which is actually scheduled at 12 o'clock. But what we're going to continue to do is we're going to continue to give that information, and we're going to continue to keep up that collaboration. Because one of the things that is most important is that as we move past this phase of shelter in place, and as we move into a new phase of long-term social distancing, trying to get our tourism economy back, trying to make sure that our domestic economy is sound, and making sure that we stimulate investment, we're going to need all hands all persons rowing in the same direction. And so for that particular perspective, Mr. Speaker, I am not going to admonish any members of the opposition for asking their questions. I'm going to do my best to answer them, because I am going to turn over a new leaf as a leader of this country, and I'm going to try to engage in the best bipartisanship that is possible as a leader of this country. And that is what I'm going to do, because that is what the people of this country require for us to get through this particular phase. There was a question from honorable members. Thank you. There was a question from honorable members regarding more help with contact tracing. I think that came from the Shadow Minister of Health. Health has been given the full resources that they do require, as the government itself is not closed, but government is working from home. Government departments and additional resources have been given to the Ministry of Health. I have told the Minister of Health that any particular person of whom she needs or require, she will have. And so that is working particularly well. There, as has been stated publicly, that there's new software that has been installed to make this contact tracing more efficiently. This afternoon, I have a meeting with Dennis Pitcher, who is marshaling public and private sector resources in order to build one of those apps for contact tracing, as we've seen in other particular countries, and we're examining whether or not we're going to use the Google Facebook model or build off the open source protocol that we have for Singapore. So these are things that are also important. But what's key to note, Mr. Speaker, is that widespread testing is the one thing that is going to assist us in our not only contact tracing, but isolation. And so the members speak about the fact that we need to test more and isolate. That is correct. Now, it's important to note that this week, we would have done far more tests than we have done in the previous 2 weeks combined. We have increased our testing capacity. We're able to test all of the persons at Matilda Smith West of nursing home. We're increasing our capacity to test frontline workers and persons in other resting homes. And I'm going to not announce today because I'm waiting for Dr. Karika Weldon to confirm the volume of tests in which she'll be able to do. But Dr. Karika Weldon is working to make sure that as of next week, we will be able to deliver 200 tests per day. Now that it will be something that will be hopefully very good, but we don't have the confirmation of that verification process yet. But that is what we are working towards, Mr. Speaker. And I want us to recognize and to understand that the only way that we're going to be able to come out to the shelter in place and make the economy work is to make sure we have widespread testing. And as I have indicated to members, and as I indicated in my opening speech, it has occupied the entirety of my time, making sure that we can pull out the stuff. I cannot tell you, Mr. Speaker, how frustrating it is for there to be officials in certain places around the world where you get a bill of lading and you expect that you'll have swabs on a shipment and it gets to the airport and it's not there because someone may have swiped at the airport because that's just what happened. It is this type of stuff, not at the airport here, but at the airport overseas. It is this type of stuff that governments are challenged with around the world. However, I did inform members of the public, and I'm happy to inform members of the opposition, that on Wednesday night, we received a shipment of 10,000 swabs. I think I actually told that for persons inside of a meeting that we had on Wednesday, that we got a shipment of 10,000 swabs. Those are being validated today, and hopefully they will work. We had a shipment earlier this week of last week of 1,000 swabs, and we got our hopes up, and those ones didn't work. So it's something that we have to make sure we validate and go through that particular process. If those swabs get validated, we have the capacity on island right now and with additional supplies which are en route to make sure that we continue an aggressive testing regime. And it is at a minimum that I expect for us to test 500 persons next week, but I expect that maybe we will be able to test more persons next week. And that I think is particularly important. There's a question about what is needed to end the shelter in place. The shelter in place is scheduled to end on May 2nd. We have 2 complete incubation cycles of suppression, and after the shelter in place ends on May 2nd, it is likely that we will revert. Back to where we were prior to going to the shelter in place, where there's going to restrictions on retail, curbside pickup, delivery, etc. So we're going to do it in a rollback and controlled fashion, followed thereafter if it is safe to do so, and if we see falling numbers and we're managing to control the infections which we have, which we fully expect to do if we have a very aggressive testing regime, that we'll be able to start opening other services like government and schools as well, because these are things that are particularly important to make sure we get our economy back to full productivity. During this particular point in time as well, we're making sure that we are bringing in PPE. There are 600,000 surgical masks which are due to arrive from Bermuda either today or on Monday. So these are things of which we are certainly working on. And so this is a process. Members of the public, members of the opposition have said that we need to have public and private sector collaboration. We are doing that. I asked the leader of the opposition for a member to join the procurement committee of which we're setting up to merge public sector and private sector resources in this, and he has given a person to sit on that committee. So that is the type of leadership in which the government is trying to provide, recognizing that the only way that we are going to get through this as a country is if we use the collective talents of both government, opposition, public sector, private sector, work permit, and Bermudian all together to make sure that we can get through this particular situation. Now, again, Mr. Speaker, there were a lot of questions about the extension of this state of emergency until the 30th. The reason is, Mr. Speaker, that we are anticipating, as I share, that the peak of this infection currently right now with the data that we have will be with us until the late summer, September. And in that particular case and instance, Mr. Speaker, as they are saying, you have to continually be able to adjust. So if you reach a point where there are more infections than you expect, there might be a cluster that may have been undetected. It might be a particular individual that manages to spread it to a lot of persons, and you have a large outbreak. You will have to come back and control these things very quickly. And unfortunately, the only mechanism underneath our laws in Bermuda as they're currently constructed is the state of emergency and emergency powers underneath the Emergency Powers Act 1963. That is the reason why the cabinet will be considering shortly, probably even on Tuesday, a paper to issue drafting instructions for amending Public Health Act. It will be the most urgent order of business of which we're looking to get to when the House Assembly comes back on May 8th. so that we can go ahead and get that done. And as I have given honorable members the undertaking here, and as I've given persons the undertaking, His Excellency the Governor, that the minute that we get those things through the House and the Senate and into law, the Cabinet will ask the Governor to rescind his declaration of state of emergency, as that will no longer be required, as we'll be able to manage these things under the Public Health Act. We are not expecting persons to stay in their house after May 2nd. We're expecting persons to follow the rules and laws as they are going to be laid out at that point in time, but we have to have the ability in order to make sure that we are flexible if there is a case of an outbreak. We've seen that happen across the world where they think that they might have to let up and they have to push back again. We don't want to find ourselves in that predicament. And though I am a great believer in the views and respect of Parliament, it is also particularly important, Mr. Speaker, to recognize, remember, that inside of this effort, there is an incredible amount of work to do. And we are making sure that we keep the opposition informed at every single point in time. The final thing I will say is on the issue of testing. As I have said, Mr. Speaker, testing is done at Helix right now to this point, and us being able to bring on a second lab, which is going through the verification process as we speak, will get us to a point where we are able to certainly ramp up our regime. We are in the top 25% of testing around the world, and we aim to, by the end of next week or the week following, to by the time we come out of the shelter in place, to be in the top 10%. The policy of the government is to aggressively test. We're going to use every resource at our disposal to make sure that we aggressively test. And I want to say that I believe that we will get there. So in closing, Mr. Speaker, I want to echo the sentiments of colleagues that this has been an incredibly difficult situation. I want to thank the colleagues for their support. I want to thank the members of the officers for their questions. I want to give homage also not only to those on the front line, but also to extend the collective condolences of the government and the people of Bermuda to all those who have lost lives and those ones who are actually now battling this particular infection. We will get through this as a country, and I do believe, Mr. Speaker, that this debate has made us stronger and has helped the country to know and understand what it is we're facing and how it is that we will get through it together. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Premier. With that, members, we will now put the matter to the floor. And as those who were on this session last night, it will be done by polling. I'm about to send you that polling now, and you just respond accordingly. It should be. Just bringing it up back onto the screen, and timed up, until. I wouldn't be able to do it. Yep. You should have, members, you should have received the question on your page now. And you can tick A, B, or C. Members, just for information, when we take a vote in the House on the votes call, we know we have a time limit for everybody to be able to get in their seat to vote, and then once that time limit is passed, you can't vote, and if you're not in your seat. Similar here, there's a time limit for the vote to be taken, and we're just letting that time limit run its course right now, as you indicate your desire.
Mr. Speaker, just one or two of our team are having a little difficulty finding the poll. If you could bear with us a minute.
Oh, okay. It should. I'll walk you through now. If on their screen to find it, they should be
The black button.
on it. On the circle. See, if you have at the bottom of your screen the 5 or 6 circles that are there. Yeah, you should have at the bottom of your screen. It's about 6 different circles. The second circle in from the right, black circle with the 3 little dots. You click on that, it should open it up for you.
Mr. Speaker, once you submit, the poll question disappears. Maybe that's.
Okay, yeah, once they've answered it, right, it'll disappear from your screen once you've answered it. And once all the results are in, I can send it all back to you.
If you look at the polling with poll questions, all it says is the presenter has not shared the poll results. But for anybody who hasn't received the question, it's not showing what the question is, Mr. Speaker.
You should have got, before you see it, I haven't shared the results, you should have got the question first.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, my members are voting.
Yeah, ours as well. I believe it's only one person that may be having difficulty, but all of ours are.
Okay, we've got 47 seconds left on that timeline. Anyone else still having difficulty finding?
Question coming from the Ministry of Health. Can it be a phone connect instead to the Wi-Fi?
Say it again.
Don't say it like that.
4 seconds left, and then we'll close out the poll and send the result.
We're good.
Thank you, members.
We're good.
The poll just closed, and I'm gonna send the poll results now. Have you received them?
Yes, can see them, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Okay. And it looks like the yeses have been outdone the noes. So the motion has passed, and the motion again is that be it resolved that in pursuant to section 14(6) of the Constitution, that this honorable house approves the continuation of the state of emergency until 6 a.m. on the 30th of June 2020, and the continuation of regulations until 6 a.m. on the 2nd of May 2020, pursuant to section 18(2) of the emergency powers of COVID-19 shelter in place regulation 2020. Members, I want to thank you for your participation this morning on this historic occasion for us to be able to meet under these conditions of shelter in place and social distancing. where we've been able to exercise the virtual space platform. And I sincerely appreciate all of us for the effort to get it to work for us today. And there have been a few stumbling blocks, but I'm sure that if we're called upon to use it more during this period, we'll improve our performance on it as time goes on. Again, to the public, listening public, I want to thank you for once again tuning in and bearing with us as we worked our way through the process of making this session possible for you today via this virtual space. I just want to close by encouraging each public to practice the safety measures that are in place, because it's for each of us to carry our own responsibility in ensuring that this virus does not spread. Because all it takes is one of us to ignore the process, and we could be that one person who's spreading it around our community and causing death to others. Please, I can't say it enough time to our public, please practice proper safety precautions. With that, members, I think we stand adjourned right now until May 8th. Otherwise, we need to come back should the need under the emergency require us to come back. But at this moment, the House now stands.
Mr. Speaker, with the leave of Mr. Speaker Michael Scott.
Yes.
Speaker, the clerk has just indicated that we need to move a motion to send a message to the governor.
Yes, thank you, thank you very much.
Yes.
I appreciate that.
Thank
Mr.
you,
Speaker,
Madam
if I may.
Clerk. Thank you, Madam Clerk. Mr. Premier, can you move that the motion
Absolutely,
be
Mr.
to send
Speaker.
a message to the governor?
Mr. Speaker, having considered the resolution which has been agreed by this honorable House, I now move that a suitable message be sent to His Excellency the Governor.
Any objections to that?
No.
No objections. It's so moved.
It is so moved.
Appreciate
Thank you
that,
very much,
Governor.
Mr. Speaker.
And
Mr.
again,
Speaker, I move that the honorable House do now adjourn until Monday, May 8th. Oh, sorry, Friday, May 8th.
Friday, May 8th. Thank you, Mr. Premier. House now stands adjourned, and members remain safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you.
Speaker.
Be safe.